Welcome everybody, and thank you for watching this video. My name is Felix Seibert. I'm a PhD student in Latin philology at the University of Tübingen in southern Germany. My research focuses primarily on how young men in ancient Latin literature are portrayed by means of their language. In short, how do they speak? Do they use, for example, special words or phrases which cannot be found in the language of other speakers? Or does there exist a kind of slang similar to the well-known phenomenon of modern youth languages? In comparison with our modern ideas of youth language, the answer must be no. But of course, there are features that are typical for the language and speeches of young men. Recent studies on Latin sociolinguistics have shown that already in ancient Roman times there existed different social acts such as the sermo urbanus, the style of the urban upper-class Romans, or the sermo rusticus, the style of the more rural population. Moreover, detailed studies have revealed evidence for a particular style of, for example, women, old men, or foreigners. Especially the linguistic differentiation according to one's age is already known since the earliest Greek texts by Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. In the following, I want to show that also young men spoke in a particular style which I call the sermo juvenilis. When I say they spoke in a particular style, I of course always talk about the literary manifestations of this style, because the reconstruction of how they really spoke seems impossible since we cannot talk to Romans anymore. As we will see, the style of young men is closely related to the common image of youth in ancient times. Therefore, in the first part of my presentation, I will give a short overview over the common image of the Roman youth and the characteristics of the juvenile style as it is explained by Cicero and Quintilian in their rhetorical works. In the second part, then I will focus on two certain cases of Roman authors and the way how they portray young characters in their works: Roman comedy and the lyric poetry of Catullus. From these two examples, I hope I can show how the juvenile style is used for different purposes in different contexts. But first of all, we have to clarify what a young man actually is. Defining the age of a Roman adolescent or juvenis correctly is quite difficult and depends massively on the context and the ancient idea of the division of age. For my purposes, I understand the adolescent as a young man of about 15 to 30 years. With 15 years at the latest, young Romans usually had received a toga virilis, which meant they were no longer regarded as children in society. The age of 30 marks the point from which on young men could start in the cursus honorum and attain the first public office as quaestor. Important for the social status as young men was also if one still stood under the patria potestas, the paternal power, which meant that he was not fully responsible for himself, but still dependent on his father's instruction and money. Usually, the patria potestas ended with the death of one's father, but one could also be released from it before. So it appears that youth in Roman antiquity was less defined by a certain age, but rather by the fact if a man already was bearing responsibility for himself, his actions, his finances, for his family, and of course, and most importantly, for the state. The common image of youth in antiquity goes back to Aristotle, who describes in his rhetoric the characteristics of young men in comparison to elders. According to him, young men are excessively passionate and ambitious. Their behavior is determined by desires and uncontrollable impulses, impetuosity and fickleness, and they do everything to excess. One of the fullest portraits of a young man in antiquity we find in Marcus Caelius, who was a student of Cicero, who defended Caelius in a case when he was probably about 32 years old. Cicero's whole defense speech is based on the portrayal of Caelius as an adolescens who has not reached full maturity yet and who can therefore not be made responsible for his behavior. Throughout the whole speech, Caelius is referred to as adolescens, who is still under the patria potestas. Already in the beginning, Cicero explains that youth is per se a restless age. This motive is present throughout the whole speech. At the end then, for example, Cicero explains that young men are naturally driven by their emotions and passions, their impetus, cupiditas and ardor, and they only want to pursue their desires, their deliciae. Caelius' dissolute lifestyle is illustrated by his preference for expensive fragrances, the unguenta, his numerous walks in public parks, his frequent participations in dinner parties, and his many holidays in Baiae, the Las Vegas of the Roman Empire. Furthermore, there is consensus within the population that youth in general is depraved, the communis infamia juventutis. These few passages, in my opinion, shed light not only on Cicero's, but also the society's view on youth in the middle of the 1st century BCE in Rome. It appears that young men usually were regarded as deficient in comparison to mature men. This deficiency shows itself not only in their behavior, but also in their attitude towards the traditional Roman virtues, the mos maiorum. Generally, young men were thought not to possess the central Roman mores such as honor, gloria, and dignitas yet. Alongside with gravitas and severitas, these rules dominated the whole social and private life, including the most important and powerful instrument of the Roman elite, their speeches and their rhetoric. Let us therefore now take a closer look at how the style of young men was characterized and described theoretically. The Sermo Juvenilis, as I understand it, is the diastratic variety of young men within the Latin language, according to their age and their social status. Briefly, I will outline its underlying concept as it can be taken from the rhetorical works of Cicero and Quintilian. There is no certain passage where they describe the style of the young man in detail, but they refer to it several times by differentiating it from the rhetorical norms and by describing its vices. The locus classicus is Cicero's criticism of his own speech Pro Sexto Roscio he had written at the age of 26, which he criticizes as juvenilis redundantia, youthful superfluity in terms of language, style, and content. A thorough analysis of the speech reveals, for example, countless repetitions and parallelisms or a large amount of synonyms and alliterations in this speech. Besides this redundantia, the youthful characteristic par excellence, as it has been called, a general tendency towards extreme language usage can be observed in young men. The most common elements by which the Sermo Juvenilis is usually characterized and which can be found in nearly every speech of a young man are exaggerated emotionality and pathos, as well as youthful passion. Furthermore, the style is regarded as vivid and even bombastic and often tends to be effeminate. All things considered, the Sermo Juvenilis appears as an incomplete language, an oratio non perfecta, that regularly contravenes the rhetorical rules of ornatus, aptum, latinitas, and perspicuitas, which is adornment, appropriateness, linguistic correctness, and lucidity. It is obvious, I think, that the vices of the Sermo Juvenilis stand in a reciprocal relationship to the common image of youth of the time as described by Cicero in Pro Caelio. Like youthful behavior, also youthful speech is considered to lack dignity, seriousness, and gravity, the central traditional mores of mature Roman men. I will now present two examples for the usage of the Sermo Juvenilis in Latin literature by different authors. The first and maybe clearest evidence for a specific youthful style can be found in the comedies of Plautus and Terence. They represent the oldest Latin texts which have survived in full length, and due to their dramatic setting, they provide the broadest basis of spoken language in ancient Latin literature. They are also particularly suitable for our purposes because the adolescens amator, the young man in love, is one of the main stock characters of Roman comedy. Usually, he is portrayed as a completely passive character, controlled by his emotions and his love for an usually inappropriate girl, and without any mature attitude or any will to act independently. This reflects also in his language usage, which is characterized by specific emphatic phrases such as self-addresses like "O me miserum" or "pour me," exclamations like "per ii," "I'm lost, I die," or frequent oaths like "me Hercle," by Hercules, which is usually used only by low characters like slaves. Together, they cause a fundamentally pathetic effect for the language of young men. In dialogues with their fathers or even their older slaves, young men usually appear submissive, what recalls the traditional relationship of patria potestas. In soliloquies, where the main linguistic characterizing happens, the young lovers show the most signs of exaggeration and redundancy. Here, one can find long rows of rhetorical questions, countless parallelistic structures, numerous antitheses, doublets, and lots of alliterations. I will exemplify this on a short passage from Plautus' Bacchides, a part of a soliloquy of the adolescens Mnesilochus, who has just found out that he had falsely accused a friend of his of cheating on him with his girlfriend. I quote the translation. Insolent, impudent, angry, tempered, uncontrollable, unreflecting, lacking restraint and self-restriction, lacking a sense of right and honor, disbelieving and demented, disagreeable, unattractive, evil-minded. That's my nature, one which briefly I prefer to see others with. Can you believe it? I think the stylistic exuberance gets clear already from the great translation of John Barsby. Mnesilochus uses no less than 10 adjectives to describe himself, arranged in a consequent parallelistic structure, but in an inconsistent mode of expression, as he constantly changes between nominative adjectives, ablatives of description, and prepositional phrases. He uses lots of alliterations without any further meaning, and he replicates nearly every idea expressed. Of course, this soliloquy reflects his emotional turmoil in this situation, but as comparisons with other comedies show, young men in most cases speak in a similarly exaggerated style. It is exactly this kind of style which Cicero criticizes more than 100 years later in his own speech, Pro Roscio, and also in other young orators. The comic adolescens and his language seem to work as models for young men and their language in general. Of course, comedy provides a fictional setting with overdrawn figures, but certain recognizable stylistic elements seem to have been taken over to literary and rhetorical production. But while comedy uses these elements primarily for differentiation between characters, later authors deliberately take advantage of the possibilities of linguistic characterization for other purposes. This is the case, for example, with the young Roman poet Catullus, a contemporary of Cicero, who opposed the whole traditional system of Roman values and life, together with his peer group, the so-called Neoterics or poetae novi, which means younger or newer poets. Instead of the traditional political career, they preferred to engage only with their poetry. There, they broke with the traditional epic concepts in the manner of Homer and followed the examples of Hellenistic poets like Callimachus instead. Catullus' usually short poems cover themes like his love for a girl and a boy, quarrels with his friends, rough invectives against his enemies, and finally social criticism, especially of the leaders of the Republic of his time, Caesar and Cicero, and of the whole social system with its corrupt structures. Often, these subjects are interwoven in a highly stylized manner. In his poems, he portrays his poetic persona as a young man without any real duties except from his poetry. His self-fashioning as a young man in terms of content is complemented by a linguistic self-fashioning which is orientated at the language of young men from Roman comedy. This is especially apparent in the beginning of his poetic book, where he introduces his poetic persona in different situations. In several poems, he takes up stylistic elements of the youthful style, such as redundant and exaggerated sentence structures, which sometimes support the situation depicted, but often seem kind of misplaced, and then he combines them with harsh criticism of the prevailing values. This is, for example, the case in a small cycle in the beginning of the corpus, in his poems 5 to 8, where he first speaks of the joys of his love with his girlfriend and later comments on his grief and anger after being abandoned by her. In all of these poems, he additionally addresses the envy of malicious old men who begrudge Catullus his love and joy because of their extremely strict values. These old men can easily be understood as representatives of the ruling gerontocracy, the senatorial class from whom Catullus wants to distance himself. The whole cycle is framed by typical elements of the Juvenile style, starting with an impressive passage of exaggerated emotionality in poem 5, up to the imitation of a typical lamentation monologue of a comic adolescence in poem 8. In between, he uses several bold but inappropriate images and similes, foreign or colloquial words, and repeated contrasting phrases. By instrumentalizing these features of the Juvenile style, which before, apart from comedy, had not been considered literary, Catullus subverts the traditional literary and rhetorical norms and values, and thus opposes the prevailing system. Self-fashioning as a young man and the usage of young people's language thus serves as demarcation against older people and subversion of their rules. I come to my conclusions. With my presentation, I wanted to explain how the Juvenile style in Roman literature is construed. In summary, we can state 3 central points. First, we have seen that the common image of youth in ancient times is rather negative. Especially in ancient Rome, young men were regarded as deficient and immature and not possessing the main virtues yet. These virtues are also relevant for the art of rhetoric. To become a good orator, or author, which is kind of the same, with high reputation, one must be in possession of the virtues of gravitas, severitas, and auctoritas. In rhetoric, they are reflected in terms of good and correct style. Young men were usually thought not to possess these virtues yet, and therefore their language and speeches were regarded as deficient and immature as well. So there seems to exist a reciprocal relationship between the image of youth and the view of the language. The second point results from this reciprocal relationship. The language of young men is usually regarded as deficient and incomplete, which is evident from numerous violations of the rhetorical rules and norms. The most common elements of this style are redundancy, exuberance, exaggerated emotionality and pathos, as well as youthful passion. In short, forms of extreme language usage and a general lack of gravity. Finally, we have seen that this style can have different functions depending on the context. In Roman comedy, it is used primarily for the portrayal of the young man as passionate but stupid lover and for linguistic differentiation from other characters. In Cicero's time, the 1st century BCE, it seems that this comic style has become the embodiment of the young man style in general, so that Cicero finds similar features in his early speeches and his contemporary Catullus can make use of it in his poetry. He consciously takes up the prejudices which are considered typical for the Sermo Juvenilis and thereby instrumentalizes this style as a language of contrast to the normative language of the elite of his time. This can be understood as an intentional break with the rhetorical norms and the moral ethical virtues associated with it. The usage of the Sermo Juvenilis serves as a demarcation against the ruling gerontocracy, and thus the language of youth already in Roman antiquity served as a means of social opposition and renewal. Thanks for watching.